Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Thursday everybody. It's a big video today. Let's begin with several important economic updates to cover. A survey from the China Index Academy published yesterday showed that China's average daily home sales during the 3-day New Year holiday in 40 cities, based on floor area, fell 26% compared with the same period last year. Critically, it was the smaller cities which saw the deepest sales decline, 50% during the holiday. The independent China-based real estate researcher expressed with the publication of the survey findings that, quote, shifts in residents' expectations and policy support are key to real estate stabilization in 2024. End quote. In a separate report published this week, China Index Academy observed that state-affiliated firms dominated the home sales and land acquisition market in 2023, with private actors being sucked deeper into the industry-wide debt and liquidity crisis. The top 6 home sellers last year were all state-owned or state-backed developers. China's largest property developer, Country Garden, which defaulted on $11 billion in dollar bonds last year, slipped from China's largest developer to the country's 7th largest, with its sales dropping 53%. China Index Academy said total sales of China's top 100 developers were down 17.3% to 6.3 trillion yuan, $883 billion in 2023 year-on-year. Critically, however, despite this collapse in sales, the total value of land use acquisition by the top 100 developers increased 1.7% last year to 1.3 trillion yuan. How is this possible? Well, the China Index Academy report shows that 89% of these land use sales were to state-affiliated developers. Before the crisis, this ratio was less than 50%. This suggests that in order to maintain land use sales, and thus local government revenue streams, local governments directed their own companies to buy up land use rights at prices and in quantities which private actors were unwilling and unable to do. It goes without saying that this is not sustainable. Next up for the economy. According to data from online recruitment platform Zhaopian Limited, wages offered to Chinese workers in major cities declined by the most on record, quote, underscoring persisting deflationary pressures and sluggish consumer confidence in the world's second-largest economy, end quote, in the words of US outlet Bloomberg. The report, published this week, showed that average salaries offered by companies to new hires in 38 key Chinese cities fell 1.3% to 10,420 yuan, $1,500 in the fourth quarter of 2023, year-on-year, the worst drop since data has been available starting in 2016. It's also the third straight quarter of decline. In Beijing, the wages decreased 2.7% year-on-year. In Guangzhou, also known as Canton in English, they fell 4.5%. Bloomberg writes that the data highlights the mounting deflation risks faced by China going into 2024, which weigh on its growth outlook. A gloomy job market means residents could pull back their spending, adding to downward pressure on consumer prices that are already falling at the steepest pace in 3 years. Quote, it also bodes ill for the property market, which is extending its worst slump in history. With an uncertain income outlook, households could continue to delay their home purchases and avoid taking out mortgages, end quote. This week, Chinese financial media outlet Caixin writes, too, that there are increasing numbers of people walking away from mortgages, reporting that the volume of judicial auction properties in the megacity of Shenzhen has increased by over 23% year-on-year, with high demand for luxury houses. This indicates a rise in situations where individuals are unable to repay debts and are forced to auction off properties. Meanwhile, Liu Qiao, professor of finance and dean of the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University, a colleague of Professor Pettis, as well as associate professor Yan Ce, have published a report this week called Increase Policy Intensity, Innovate Policy Tools and Promote the Sustained Recovery of the Economy, China's Economic Outlook and Recommendations for 2024. The full report is long and worth a read for anyone interested in this topic. Among other conclusions, the report argues, quote, insufficient consumption of residences is the crux of the current economic problem. The reasons for this lack of consumption can be attributed to three aspects. First, the scarring effect brought about by the pandemic still exists, leading to a lack of confidence and weak expectations among residents. Second, the growth rate of per capita disposable income of residents in China has declined, with the income growth rate of low-income groups, which have a higher marginal propensity to consume, being the lowest. Third, real estate and financial investments are important components of residents' wealth, and there has been a significant shrinkage in residents' wealth." End quote. Once again, none of this should be surprising to regular China Update viewers, but the fact that such prominent Chinese economists are publishing these arguments in such a public way shows how concerned domestic commentators are becoming. The report argues that increasing income for people via different channels will be key to maintaining growth in 2024, even calling for directly giving subsidies to low-income groups. The report says that preventing the housing market from a hard landing will be equally important. Next up, we move to debt. I hope you're enjoying today's episode. If you're getting some value from this episode, I only have one ask. That is to like and subscribe. This is the primary way in which this channel grows. The main way it is shown to new people is if the algorithm is happy. For anyone who wants to help keep the channel financially sustainable, which allows me to continue doing this every day, open and free for all, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. My commitment has been a channel open to all that is reliant primarily on subscriber support rather than corporate sponsorship. And with your assistance, I know I can keep it that way. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. Next up, for the economy, 2024 will be a big year for local government debt coming due. China's local government financing vehicles have 4.65 trillion yuan, $651 billion worth of bonds due over the next 12 months. That's the highest amount on record and is roughly 13% more than what came due last year. Zelena Zeng, senior credit analyst at Credit Sites Inc., expressed on this quote, "Containing the credit contagion and the systemic financial risk from the local government financing vehicle sector remain top priorities for the central government this year." End quote. Chinese developers face a tsunami of debt obligations too. Chinese financial media outlet Yicai writes that banks have mainly targeted credit at state-owned developers, explaining that it's difficult for private builders to secure debt. Quote, "And even if they can, the amount is usually small." End quote. This year's maturing debt total is much bigger than in 2023, Yicai explains. Quote, "Given the financing environment and sluggish property sales, some of last year's defaulters may also fail to repay debt in 2024. End quote. Adding that China's property developers have approximately $100 billion worth of offshore and onshore bonds falling due this year, an 11% increase versus 2023. The repayment pressure will be highest in March and August. Next up, the Chinese spy balloon is quite an old story now. However, it appears to be making another round in US media. US outlet NBC News has two recent stories on the event, presenting fresh assertions about the event and its implications for US-China relations, and more specifically, US domestic politics. The outlet argues that privately, Biden administration officials, quote, "complained that the political outcry over the balloon was wildly disproportionate to any threat it posed to US national security." End quote. In their view, the outlet explains, because China was so angered and humiliated, the damage done to the relationship between Washington and Beijing was a far greater threat to the US than the balloon itself. Administration officials at first hoped to conceal the balloon's existence from the public and from Congress. One former senior US official briefed on the balloon incident reportedly told the outlet, quote, "Before it was spotted publicly, there was the intention to study it and let it pass over and not ever tell anyone about it." End quote. In a separate report, the same outlet, NBC News, reported that the balloon had connected to a US-based company to send and receive communications from China, primarily related to its navigation. The FBI forensics team that examined the balloon after it was shot down completed a classified report about the equipment it carried. its findings remain secret. I would say, and this is my own personal view, so take it with a grain of salt, that they will probably be leaked this year. Interestingly, over the last week or so, several major US outlets have published long-form articles on the challenges to the US Chinese espionage efforts are increasingly presenting. In Chinese Spy Agency Rising to Challenge the CIA, the New York Times, for example, writes, "In meetings during the pandemic with Chinese technology contractors, they complained that surveillance cameras tracking foreign diplomats, military officers, and intelligence operatives in Beijing's embassy district fell short of their needs. The spies," the outlet writes, "asked for an artificial intelligence program that would create instant dossiers on every person of interest in the area and analyze their behavior patterns. They proposed feeding the AI program information from databases and scores of cameras that would include car license plates, cell phone data, contacts, and more. The AI-generated profiles would allow the Chinese spies to select targets and pinpoint their networks and vulnerabilities." The outlet continues, "Chinese government experts openly admire the collection capabilities of American spy agencies and their technology. Chinese intelligence journals often carry studies examining U.S. operations. A recent study of U.S. national security services by the China Institutes of Contemporary International Relations, the main Ministry of State Security Research Institute, said, quote, "Drawing on an in-depth assessment of the relevant methods in the United States, China should choose what works and dispense with what does not." End quote. In a piece published around the same time as this New York Times piece, called "American Spies Confront a New Formidable China," the US-based Wall Street Journal writes that in the early 2000s, CIA analysts began warning frequently about China's economic growth and military ambitions. Collectively, this stream of classified intelligence reports became known among government insiders as the Scary China Brief. Quote, "The US lost its human network in China just as Xi became Communist Party leader in late 2012, and then president a few months later. Multiple, sometimes daily, CIA reports predicted he would be a different kind of Chinese leader, more forceful, nationalistic, and security-focused," current and former intelligence officials said. Several officials said the analysis was largely ignored by President Barack Obama's White House, which hoped that as China grew economically, it would liberalize and join the US-led international world order. End quote. Of course, this did not happen. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you very much, everybody, for watching. Have a wonderful Thursday, and I will see you all tomorrow.